Welcome to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard. Thank you so much for joining us once again. I'm going to be speaking with Mr. Rich Daly. He's Chief Operating Officer at Beyond Spring Incorporated, which is a biopharmaceutical company. And he's joining us to talk about their flagship asset, which is currently in late-stage development for the treatment of non-small cell lung cancer and the prevention of neutropenia. Welcome to the program, Mr. Rich Daly. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, give us a brief background about your area of expertise, and then tell us what Beyond Spring is all about.
Sure. Well, I'm a microbiologist by training, but about 5 or 30 years ago, I joined the biopharmaceutical industry, and I've pretty much worked in every area of the biopharmaceutical industry, from the commercial side to the R&D side. I've run every single side of the operation. And most recently ran a small biotech company, publicly traded. And about a year and a half ago, I joined Beyond Spring. Mm-hmm. And we're an oncology-focused company working in the area of chemo-induced neutropenia, which is an area of great unmet medical need. And we're really excited about the product we have called Plinabulin, which is in late phase 3, as you mentioned. And we're really excited about the work that we're doing and the opportunity to help patients have a better chemotherapeutic experience and potentially actually have better outcomes associated with chemotherapy.
Now, what is neutropenia and why is there an unmet need for this?
So when a patient undergoes chemotherapy, it's kind of, think of it like a blunt instrument. Chemotherapy really goes after any rapidly reproducing cell. So cancer cells, rapidly reproducing cells, white blood cells, your first line of defense against infection, rapidly reproducing cell. Cancer cells, obviously not good. White blood cells, obviously very good. Mm-hmm. The chemotherapy goes through and destroys pretty much, or attempts to destroy pretty much both of them. So when you take out the white blood cells, you have a higher propensity for infection. And this is not good for a patient who's going through chemotherapy. So what we want to do is we want to avoid that or minimize the chance of neutropenia. And about 30 years ago, a class of drugs came out, a great class of drugs called GCSS, or granulocyte colony stimulating factors. And these drugs have been in use for 30 years and done a really good job of minimizing the effect of chemo-induced neutropenia. However, they don't do a good enough job. And so we've been studying Plinabulin in combination with GCSFs. And what we're seeing are better results, and it's enabling patients to actually have a more favorable CIN profile, or white blood cell count profile. So really exciting opportunity, because the number one reason why patients change their chemo regimen, that is, decrease their dose, delay their cycles, discontinue their cycles, or downgrade their chemotherapy, is because of chemo-induced neutropenia. And when that happens, their overall survival is decreased. So anything you can do to prevent CIN is favorable for the patient.
How often is a patient a good candidate for this type of treatment? The reason that they decrease are varied, but are some candidates just not good candidates for this type of treatment on the outset? Or is that something that you find out with trial and error?
Great question. So there are about 800,000 patients who are diagnosed, about 800,000 patients who actually will undergo chemotherapy in the United States this year. And typically you can think about it in this way. A patient that is at high risk for CIN, there'll be about 33% of those patients will experience CIN. So about a third, and a third. So they go and fall into categories of high risk, intermediate risk, and low risk. And those categories are really important to think about. So the patients who are high risk, the recommendations are that those patients would get a prophylactic treatment, a treatment that prevents CIN before they start chemotherapy. Patients that are at intermediate risk, those patients who are somewhere lower, a little bit lower risk, the physician would watch them. And if they develop CIN after their first cycle of chemotherapy or their second cycle, then the physician would give them a therapeutic treatment to prevent CIN in their following cycles. So you can think about 200 or 300,000 patients a year would get CIN. So it's a pretty common occurrence. So it's something we really want to watch out for. However, recently, the bodies that go and make these recommendations about who should get these therapies, your question is a rather timely one. With COVID-19, the recommendation has just changed within the last 2 weeks. So whereas previously patients who should be getting GCSFs prophylactically were only the high-risk patients, now the recommendation is high risk and the intermediate risk patients should be getting prophylactic treatment. So now you're talking about roughly 2/3 of patients should be getting these prophylactic treatments.
With the results from this Plinabulin being so promising, you're in late stage development. What do you see as far as the next step for this treatment?
So very great question. So we actually have Boeing submission in China, and we anticipate filing our submission in the United States later this year. So again, we're really excited, and we want to bring this to market as quickly as possible because we see a significant reduction in these higher grades of neutropenia, which put these patients at risk. So working effectively with a GCSF, we see a substantial reduction in CIN. And also with GCSS, there's an adverse event that's associated with GCSS, which is bone pain. And interestingly enough, when you combine a GCS Plinabulin, our data to date show that the bone pain is significantly reduced. So it's an interesting finding and one that would potentially benefit patients immensely because comfort, especially when you're going through chemotherapy, is something that the physicians really want to take advantage of, and obviously the patients do as well.
There are drugs that induce white blood cell production. How does Plinabulin interact with those drugs? Do those drugs have to be completely stopped, or can they be reduced and still be used in combination with Plinabulin?
So GCSFs are the predominant players in the production of or drugs that are using the production of white blood cells. So we actually work very differently. So those are granulocyte convolution factors, and they work a little bit later after the chemotherapy is started. So what you typically do with those drugs is you give chemotherapy, let's call it day 1. You give chemotherapy, and then you have to give those drugs on day 2. Now, interestingly enough, you can either give that as an injection on day 2, or you can give what's called an on-body device. So the nurse or the physician would apply an on-body device that would automatically inject the drug 25, 27 hours later. Very convenient for the patient. Again, great drugs. We love those drugs. With Plinabulin, the patient takes their chemotherapy treatment in clinic, and 30 minutes later, they get a 30-minute infusion of Plinabulin. And the drug, because it's different from a GCSF, works differently. And we see protection for the white blood cells early in the cycle for Plinabulin and later in the cycle for GCSF. So what we see is broader coverage across the entire chemotherapy cycle and potentially better coverage and reduction in bone pain. So the patient then stays out of this, what we call the danger zone of grade 3 and 4 neutropenia. So again, the goal is to avoid this potential for infection, which, as I said earlier, is the number one reason why physicians will want to do what we call the 4 Ds: decrease the dose, delay the dose, discontinue the therapy altogether, or downgrade it so that the patient has less likelihood of experiencing chemo-induced neutropenia. And what we want to get to really are the 4 S's: stable dose, sustained cycles, strongest regimens, and staying the course. Because it's really, really sensitive. It's really, think of it as sort of a cruel twist. So here's a patient who's got cancer. They're going in for chemotherapy, and the physician has that, that opportunity to really go for cure, and they experience CIN. And even slight reductions or slight changes in therapy can make a big difference. So there are a significant number of studies that show, for instance, a 15% reduction in dose can have a 50% reduction in overall survival. That's meaningful. So if we, together with the GCSFs, can keep that dose high enough, there's a potential that we can actually improve the opportunity for patients to have better outcomes. And that's what we're really shooting for.
Where can we get some more information about Beyond Spring online?
It's beyondspringpharma.com.
beyondspringpharma.com. Thank you so much, Rich. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Right. You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard, in conversation with Mr. Rich Daly, Chief Operating Officer at Beyond Spring Incorporated. Audio copies of this program are available at hpr.fm and healthprofessionalradio.com.au. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Listen in, download at SoundCloud, and be sure and subscribe to our YouTube channel on youtube.com, Health Professional Radio.